The following video is brought to you by AmpProbe. We have Matt McKinney back with us, and we're talking about flush, which many of you think is the devil itself. I know if Ralph were here, he'd say flush is the devil if he weren't saying nest is the devil, but that's what a lot of people think. But I think the best thing to do is, Matt, you can start off and just tell us what flush actually is. What's it made out of, and what's its purpose?
So you asked about the ingredients of line set flushes. Most of them are all pretty similar, some readily available, at least in the world of finding chemicals. There's nothing too crazy in them. Like I said, I don't know if anybody wants to write them down for the test, but I'll tell you right now, like for line set flushes, you're pushing a solvent type item through there that is going to strip that line set out. So your solvents are a good amount of what's actually in the flush itself. So you have like dichloroethane is an example of what makes up like the majority of our flush. You can add in something like a butane type hydrocarbon as well, which kind of enhances that. So you have like a pentafluorobutane is something else that goes inside of them. And then you need a pushing element, something to help propel it. So for that, we actually use just tetrafluoroethane. And for the 7 people in your audience that knows what tetrafluoroethane is, it's commonly referred to as R134A. Same 134A that goes in your automotive AC, that goes into a refrigerator, goes into a small fridge. So that's actually what we're using to push that dichloroethane, which is the majority of our blend, through that system. Those are going to be designed to strip any of the contaminants, non-condensables, carbon, things that are physically pressed onto that line set. You want to make sure that you have something on there that can displace those from the copper on your line set and run them through this system. And of course, with any of the flushes, if they look at the ingredients, you always want to follow with that nitrogen and make sure you don't have anything left in the system.
That's very interesting that it has R134A in it. And I recognized the refrigerant sounding names. I won't say that I knew exactly what they were. I felt like I knew what 134A was.
Yep.
I felt like I was one of the 7. How can it be that you can blow refrigerant through a line set? How is that acceptable?
134A has special permissions. They use 134A in foam blowing. If you're a manufacturer, in your manufacturing process, it involves blowing foam. A lot of them use 134A because they want to blow with something cold for whatever reason in the foam blowing process. So yeah, they are allowed to foam blow with 134A. I know they're trying to get away from it, but because it is a non-ozone depleting substance, they do get the special permission. You can use 134A in the pushing and blowing of various chemicals.
A long time ago, somebody told me that they thought it would be a good idea to blow refrigerant to the line set to clean it out. And I said that they were nuts, but essentially that was sort of true.
That was the mainstream for many years. There's a reason why things like RX11 are called RX11, because it's a play on the old refrigerant name R11, which is an old refrigerant. It's actually still used in some rare cases today in chillers. People used to use R11 to flush a lot of things out, and they abused that horribly because they would clean a lot of stuff with R11. It was a very good cleaner, but also what it was really, really good at was tearing apart our atmosphere. So they came in during the Clean Air Act and said, okay, you got to stop cleaning things, flushing things with R11. They stopped the production on a lot of those chillers. Some of them are still in place today. The chillers are. There's still a couple wholesalers out there I've been working with, and you can see them still today. They've got those barrels of R11 for some of those chillers that are out there. But I know the country's been working pretty hard to get away from them and get those replaced out. And I even found in my doctorate in flush I was made to go get when researching a lot of this stuff, when I get challenged to go learn some more, you can actually go and find old documents. I think one of them was on Train or Linux's website. It was an installation guideline, and it talked about flushing the existing line sets with R22.
Interesting. Yeah. R22.
And I bet you can find a lot of your listeners that have been around a while. You'll find a lot of them that back then, hopefully back then and not recently, that there's a lot of people that used to flush with R22. Now, mind you, that was probably when it was a quarter or a fifth of the price it is today. But you could flush things with R22.
Now we're talking 1980s maybe, or is it earlier than that?
Yeah, 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s. You could find people that were flushing with the actual refrigerant, just blowing it out the other side, not trying to capture it or anything. So yeah, that's why the venting laws went into effect after the Clean Air Act of 93. They've said, okay, all these practices of just launching all these ozone depleting substances into the atmosphere, we've got to stop that. That's why flushes started debuting in the mid to late 90s when flushes came out, because you couldn't use those old methods anymore. So they had to find essentially non-ozone depleting chemicals that could perform, that could flush without damaging the system and being flammable or anything.
So just for reference, going back a little bit in our conversation, R11 is a CFC refrigerant, so they were ozone depleting, correct?
Yes, yeah. So like R11, R11, R12, 500, 502, R22, all ozone depleting. They were a part of that big hit in the mid 90s when they went after the CFCs and HCFCs. Well, we're still going after the HCFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons with their large ozone depletion potential, especially R11, which was, I think, one of the higher ones. They said, okay, no more. That included flushing. Now, again, the system was already charged with R11 or R12. You could continually service that, but that refrigerant is going to become a little bit harder to find and a heck of a lot more expensive. I know R12 today still, I think it's $1,000 or more for a cylinder of it. It's pretty expensive.
Yeah, I think you have to search eBay and find just that guy with it in his garage if you really want it.
He's got grandpa's old jug of DuPont Freon 12, still got the wrap on it, and he's going to try to get $1 million out of it.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, exactly right. Well, let's talk about when you flush, because I'm a guy that was not always a believer in flush and not always meaning until you convince me otherwise. So tell me, when do you flush the system? Because I know there's manufacturers out there that have put out no flush bulletins, which is kind of like a red flag right there.
Yes.
So maybe address that and tell us when is the proper time to flush a system.
Sure. I'll address the OEM side of it too, because my history with flush goes back 5 years ago when I was at a wholesaler and we had 3 or 4 maybe different types of flushes that we had worked with. Since I've been here at Icor Chemours 4 years now around flush, I still have not found and haven't been given the actual service bulletin that says they are banned from using flush like in their equipment. What I have found is from the OEMs, and it's only a couple of them, say don't push flush into the compressors, don't leave it in the condenser, don't leave it in the coil. But I've never really found an outright ban like some people have described, and I've gotten into some wonderfully heated, lovely etiquette arguments on Facebook, which is where everyone is very civil in this discussion. But I kind of put it out there. I said, can anybody provide me this document? And I got a lot of hate mail out of that one, but out of all the hate mail, I never got a document. Now, I've had people show me stuff that had Trane's logo on it and said, well, this is it. Well, it wasn't from Ingersoll Rand. It was someone who put Trane's logo on a Word document. It was not a publication. I'm like, I can slap an OEM logo on anything and send it out. I'm glad people are trying to do their due diligence and be safe and not trash customers' equipment. I can completely agree with that, especially with some chemicals out there that some companies try to sell to enhance systems. If you know what I'm talking about, they said, put this in your system and make it better. I get weary about some of those because, we don't know what's going on. But flush is pretty well known and been around for a couple decades. So problem with them is, again, don't leave them in the system. That's really what it comes down to. So when it comes to when should you be flushing, I get some confusion there as well because I get people wanting to talk about what refrigerants. If I'm going from refrigerant A to refrigerant B, whether it's going from 22 to 410A and leaving the line set, or they'll say, well, I'm using an R22 replacement. This one says I need to flush, but this one doesn't say I need to flush. They're getting wrapped around the confusion of the refrigerants. Ignore the refrigerant. Get the refrigerant out of your mind completely. You're not flushing the refrigerant. You're flushing the line set, and what you're trying to prevent is old oil, old contaminant crossover. Okay. So if you're taking in and you're going from an R22 system to a 410A system, like they're doing outside of my house right now, and the line set's good, you can flush that line set out because you're changing the compressor oil, right? You went from a mineral oil compressor to all of your R410A compressors, your 407C compressors. They're all charged now with the POE lubricant, polyester lubricant. The problem with POE, and they've known this since it came out 20 plus years ago, was POE by itself has solvent-like properties to it. So it's stripping inside of there. And actually, I found some really old documents, I believe, from Copeland that even, I think, warned about this years ago. I got some like 15-year-old publications for them saying, hey, you got to be careful with POE. It will pull things off that line if you hadn't flushed it. They encourage you to flush the line sets. So again, if they're changing the compressor, changing the compressor oil, and again, it's just good on old systems anyway, especially a system that's been leaking. Even though a system's leaking and you think of stuff going out of the system, it's actually allowing things to come into the system as well. Anytime you've got that, you're reusing a line set like that, that's a good time to flush. So again, I get people that kind of get stuck on the refrigerant. No, if you're reusing line set, always better off making sure it is squeaky clean. I had a guy yesterday just call me. He works for a significant installer here in Indy. They primarily do new install. He said, well, the pipe wiper, right? Is that what it's called?
It's called a pipe wiper, and the
Yes.
slang for it is pap wapper.
The Pat Wapper. So he was talking about they thought about doing both, flushing it, pipe wiping, and then following with nitrogen. And they're like, can we do that? I'm like, yeah, I think that's going to take care of it. That's doing even more. But I said, hey, I mean, it's good to not leave anything in the system. I would always discourage too against just using the dry nitrogen because it's an inert gas. I have people say, well, I've pushed nitrogen through it and you can see the gunk and the little oil residue and everything coming out the other side. I said, well, that's the sheer velocity of the nitrogen pushing it. I said, but it's not scrubbing. It's not in there breaking things apart like you get with these proprietary solvents we use in there that are made to break down these types of carbon oil mixtures that are stuck to that copper. I see a lot of people just doing the dry nitrogen. Again, it's always better to do that. And then, of course, changing your filters also helps too during that process. You don't want to flush and not change that stuff out. The other thing with flushing too is tell people to read the guidelines. That'll also be a big helper. It's a line set flush. And if you push and leave 1, 2, 3 pounds of flush in your coil, and then you try to charge it with refrigerant or stuff, or you try to pull a vacuum on that, you don't want to leave all that flush in the system and possibly have it stay in there. So that's why it's line set flush. Have people tell me they flush coils. I said, okay, well, take in mind you need to work with your nitrogen to try to get as much of that out. So I've had people cut the coils out and take them outside and blow the heck out of them to make sure that stuff's out of there. We've had those rare instances where someone tries to put 5 pounds of flush in there and they're going, it's not coming out the other side. Like, well,
it's super clean in there.
Yeah, you got a 5-story lift and you just filled that coil up with flush. So yeah, you're going to go ahead and work and get that out of there now.
Unless flush is going to be your refrigerant.
Yeah, hey,
then you can fill it with flush.
Yeah, it's got 134A in it, so it might take you about 20 pounds, but you might start getting some cooling. Your compressor will be dead in about 15 seconds, but trying to run that liquid through there. But yeah, I would just tell people I've been at this for years on the flush. They work really well. They're not out there trashing systems again. Like I said, we get those rare instances of people that don't read the book. There's not really a book on our flush. It's printed on the side of the box that you buy. Push it through the system, follow it with some nitrogen, do your due diligence, change a filter. It's going to work to help make sure you don't contaminate a brand new system.
I have several questions since you were talking there, and I've formulated them in response here. So I'm going to go right through one by one.
Sure.
Okay. You're separating flush from other add-ons in the refrigerant circuit because flush is not supposed to remain in the refrigerant circuit, whereas the other add-ons are designed to be there, even though I may not agree with them being there. That is the difference you're saying?
Yeah, so they have those other things they can put in the system, but by design, like in an air conditioner, it's supposed to have 2 things in there, oil and refrigerant. So you want to make sure you remove anything in that system that's not those 2 things. So yes, there's those add-on items that people are putting in there, those I'll just generically call them enhancers. I really can't speak to those, but again, just strictly for the flush, push it through, get nitrogen and get it out, and then that's what you want to leave it like.
Perfect. I think we'll bring in John Pastorello from Refrigeration Technologies to go over the enhancers again, because enhancers is what they would call them. I call them air conditioning cancer. That's what I call it. That's just my thing for it. It's blatant. It gets your attention, though.
I haven't done my full white paper research on what all those do. I mean, someone somewhere, they believe it works enough to go ahead and sell it. I mean, I don't know if it's snake oil, but I'd like to see feedback from the field on if there's any measurable, somehow an observable difference there. But yeah, I wouldn't speak to that. Not in my pocketbook here.
Don't worry, Matt. We got it covered. We have a guy for that. So don't worry about that. Now, I want to talk about the oil in the system that you're removing with flush. Okay. Over the last maybe decade, the feelings on oil intermingling between different types, POE and mineral, have kind of softened. There's a leeway with it. So is it really the oil or the contaminated portion of the oil that you're really concerned with? Is oil the culprit, or is contamination the culprit, or is it both?
Contamination is the culprit, and you are exactly right. And I'm glad you asked that question because it does come up with people going, wait, I'm reading right here, and you can read from Copeland and all these other folks where it says, hey, there's tolerance between residual mineral oil being in the system and adding the new POE oil. But again, we're talking strictly chemical oil to chemical oil. The problem with that mineral oil is, like in my system outside right now, that's 24 years old. That thing's never been changed. That's original 24-year-old oil. Who knows what it's held on to during that time? And again, what's stuck on that line, and when POE gets in there, POE will strip that line for you. If you had leaked over the years, which mine obviously has the past little bit, it's leaked down. So even when you're leaking, it's contaminating the inside of the system when you're leaking. No idea when my filter was changed. It's the contaminant story, not the oil story. The oil is holding the contaminants, though. It's combined inside of there. It's not always going to come out with a vacuum. That's why you want to use that solvent.
I can understand that. Guilty by association. Poor mineral oil hanging out with the wrong people.
I know. It gets a bad rap, but they are tolerant of each other. Now, there's debate on the percentages. 10% residual, and blah, blah, blah. The two oils aren't going to mix and create, I'll use your word, like cancer in the system. It's not going to automatically generate like acid or alcohol or something like that. It's what is in that mineral oil is what we're worried about. And if it holds moisture, that's another thing. You don't want any of that oil that can hold some moisture in it, because when POE mixes with water and moisture, it generates acid. So that's why they're always worried about filters being more critical on those POE 410A systems, because their ability to generate acid is much greater than mineral oil.
Absolutely. That's a good point right there. Much different than using an old mineral oil.
Yeah.
The last question I had for you, well, I say last question, that's not true. The next question I have for you, you talked about the pipe wiper, also known as the pap wiper. Can you use it without flush? Because I think they intended without flush, I think.
Yeah, I watched his video he did on it. I see what it does. But it's not stripping. You know what I mean? It's not getting into the pores of that. Now, yeah, you're physically removing anything that's physically in its way. Just like cleaning the barrel of a rifle or a shotgun, you want something in there to help break up what's stuck in there. You can run a snake through a barrel, just like cleaning a gun, but you also want to put something in there. And then just like when you clean a gun, you want to dry it out afterwards too, using that nitrogen. So just like a gun, you want to wipe it dry afterwards. I would always encourage to use a liquid, like we have a liquid vapor, flush.
Well, our buddy Joe Shearer, who was part of that Bosch debate that you were mentioning before we got started here, he uses a combination of the pipe wiper and flush.
Yeah,
so
that's
extra.
I can imagine that's got to be, like I mentioned with my buddy here in town, they're going to start doing that. I was like, that sounds like it's probably the most effective way to ensure. You have people tell you nicely or not nicely, but they'll say, "Oh, I've only used nitrogen. I've never had a problem." Well, I'm not saying that if you don't flush, that system's going to die in a day. It could take months. It could take even maybe years. You could be generating acid in that system and you not even know it, and you're not going to know it for a while sometimes. Had cases where we had a guy come to us with 5 dead systems. He wasn't using any of our products, but he called our tech support line kind of out of desperation. This was down in Nashville, Tennessee about 3 years ago. And he goes, "I've got 3 dead systems." And we actually were going to go down there, and we end up looking at these and we're going, "Did you flush out these 19-year-old line sets?" And he's like, "Nope." And he reused the coils. He put in R22 dry charge systems. He left the coils and line set and everything, didn't flush a thing. And I'm like, I got a feeling, you gunked these things. You put in those R22 units that he put in, they were dry charge, but all of them had POE oil compressors. Electrical was fine. All this other stuff, we're going, what the heck, And finally someone was like, "This guy didn't flush." Yeah. Took like 2 to 3 weeks. He said they were fine, 2 to 3 weeks. And I said, I bet it took 3 weeks and that oil was going through there, scrubbing them out. You junked 5 compressors. So that's about the most extreme example I've ever seen, but I'm like, nothing else. They couldn't find anything else wrong with it.
My question for that guy would be, and you probably asked this, so I'm going to ask you, did you ask him if he used R22 in the dry charge unit?
He actually used a different R22 alternative. It wasn't ours at the time. That's what we thought. We thought, oh, this could be our competitor's gas, and we're going to go show that it was our competitor that was wrong. He was too. He thought, oh, it's got to be the refrigerant. We looked in there and refrigerant charge was fine. And it was POE oil. So the POE oil is going to work with that refrigerant anyway. This isn't adding up. We looked at it and was like, "Did you flush nitrogen, anything in the system?" He's like, "No, I just hooked it up. That's what the supplier told me to do." I was like, well, you took advice from the supplier. That can be risky sometimes, unless it's a guy like Ralph, who's the expert at the supplier. I said, but them counter guys, man, I said, sometimes they're really good, and sometimes they give you advice like this, like, "Hey, just hook up and go with these systems." Now, there could have been other factors in there, but I was like, this is what it's looking like.
That's a good point, too, about the compressors being POE. Those last few years of dry charges were all POE compressors.
All of them. There could have been ones that were mineral, but I know when I was in supply, when I worked at a supplier here, all of ours were POE. And then again, just working out in the field with other wholesale companies and seeing their dry charge systems, I don't remember seeing any that were mineral oil that were built of the days of the dry charge that some people miss so dearly.
Yeah, I think that was about 2013 when they went from using mineral oil charges and compressors over to POE. I'm pretty sure about that.
I know. Yeah, Copeland started many years ago making sure that all of them, because they knew that was going to be the future anyway. So they just said, let's just go with this one.
You were mentioning where flush can be trapped. Compressors, evaporator coils. Are there parts of the system, and if so, what parts cannot be flushed.
Basically, there's no reason to anyway. There's no reason for it to go into a condenser or a compressor at all. I see this stuff online and guys talking about flushing compressors. I have no idea why they would want to do that. They said, oh, I'm doing an oil change. I'm like, yeah, that's too many spots in there. How can you ensure you're getting it out? I wouldn't advise trying to push it through a condenser or a compressor. Our guidelines say don't do it with the coil. Not that it's not possible. It's just you got people that may not be able to get it out, or they may not even attempt to get it out properly. If you got a 100-foot line set, you want to make sure you don't have a trap in there or something that the flush isn't going to stay at. Now, I'll tell you, if they do those steps correctly, though, they push through, follow nitrogen, and you can pull a vacuum, that's going to boil off that flush because it boils off at a lower temperature anyway. I mean, that stuff's boiling at like 98 or whatever degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. So if you pull a vacuum, it's going to boil it off. You're going to get it out of there. Watch out for those spots in the system, especially the components. That's where you have a higher propensity of being able to keep it. We just tell people you got to avoid that stuff. That's why we call it a line set flush.
That's understandable. And the line set flush part, it's obvious. Line set flush, but
yeah,
I've actually ignored that, I don't know, subconsciously or something before, because I didn't use flush for a long time because I was having issues with the vacuum. And I think it's because of the procedures that I didn't follow. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a scenario and you tell me what should be done. Okay. There's a change out. Let's say it's a change out at your house. Let's say you have an air handler in the attic or gas furnace coil in the attic or something like that. You have a condenser outside. You have your liquid line and suction line just runs over, runs down the wall and goes out. What should you do in that situation to flush those lines?
Well, I'll tell you what's been real popular is going up into the attic, going to where your coil is. And I've had guys raise a loop. So they cut right there at the evaporator. And even if they're leaving the evaporator, they're going to try to reuse it for the new install, or they're putting a new one in. Regardless, they braze a loop at the inside on the two different lines. And then they go back outside, hook the flush in, start pushing. It goes inside, hits the loop, comes right back out. And then he can run it until he sees it run clear. So he's watching that flush come out, say in a bucket next to him with a couple of rags in it, and he's watching that flush come out and he's seeing it's kind of black and murky, and then it gets kind of gray, and then it's just a little milky. And then once that flush is crystal clear, once that first clear flush comes out, he shuts his flush flow off, grabs the nitrogen, starts pushing, and you'll see it start dribbling out. And once it basically gets down to its last little droplets, he stops. You're going to ask, how much flush does that normally take? And that's completely dependent on, again, when does it run clear? It could be a half a pound of flush based on the line set. If it's a 35-foot line set, it could be half a pound, 3/4 pound of flush, dependent on how dirty is it, how long is the line set. Those things will play into factor. That rule of thumb, unfortunately, a lot of us have had to market a rule of thumb that says, oh, it should take a 1 pound for a 2 to 3 ton system or something like that. People scream to have those out there, like, how much do I use? Well, the answer always was, you flush it until it's clean. So it didn't matter if it took a pound and a half, it took a pound and a half. It's never going to be the same. It's just like cleaning a car or anything else. You can't say, oh, it takes 1 ounce of this and 2 ounces of that to clean something. It's clean until it's clean.
And after you're done flushing, you follow it up with nitrogen until it's no more flush coming out, just dry.
Yeah, you'll see it. You'll see it it'll kind of be spitting out there a little bit. You'll see some droplets coming out, and after you wait a few seconds of pushing and nothing's coming out anymore, you've gotten the bulk of it out right there. You do pinch those lines. I kind of forgot that on the first step, but it is in the instructions. You pinch those lines. That helps build that pressure up in the system too when you're flushing. And also when you're following with nitrogen, it'll build that pressure up and span that gas and make sure it's grabbing everything coming through, not just riding on top of it. Don't fight gravity too much. I mentioned it, I think, before we even started, had a gentleman trying to fight 4 or 5 stories of lift. I said, why wouldn't you go inside and try pushing that flush outside? And kind of got angry at me for pointing that out. But yeah, if you're fighting a significant amount of gravity, I've been to apartments, and I know I did the one in Memphis we were at, and they were going to flush 7 stories. Actually, their condensers were on the roof 7 stories up, going straight down because it's Memphis. So then they asked about flushing. I'm like, yeah, you need to flush here. I said, but don't you try to fight. Don't you try to fight that gravity too much. I said, you can get up on that roof and flush down. Would probably be better than try trapping it in there.
That would be a good time not to use the loop method.
Yes. Yeah. You got to have a bunch of flush sitting down in the apartment there.
So let's say a guy goes out to the job site and he decides not to read the side of the box like a lot of guys don't do. And he puts flush into the system and he leaves the evaporator in place. He's just going to cut it loose after he's done and then take the line set out, or he's reusing the evaporator, let's say. Mm-hmm. What's going to happen if he leaves half a pound of flush in there, then charges the system up? What's going to be the ill effect?
If all of it doesn't come out with the vacuum and he actually has a good amount of flush that somehow stays trapped in that system, it's going to react with that refrigerant and that refrigerant oil. So one, you'll see it on the gauges. It's going to affect that PT chart. And I mean, like I said, I'm not talking about droplets here or film of flush. I'm talking about ounces and ounces and ounces of actual liquid flush being left in the system. Then yes, you're going to see it possibly on your PT chart, and you might see it react with the compressor oil. That compressor is just not going to like that. These are very rare instances. And in 4 years, I don't think we've ever had a case where someone was like, this flush killed the compressor. I don't think we've had a single case in 4 years, but we always warn against it because of, again, I've had guys call before they put refrigerant in the system. And like I said, I know the one call I've taken in 4 years was a guy had to have over 3 pounds of flush in the coil because he's like, I'm outside. He was flushing
That's
up.
a lot.
He was flushing up 4 or 5 stories, and he's like, it's not coming out the other side. I said, well, a lot of questions here. One, why are you fighting gravity? I said, and two, did you braze a loop on the inside or something? And he's like, no, I'm just pushing it through the coil, but nothing's coming out the other side. This flush is junk. It's your fault. Okay, well, I didn't invent gravity, and I didn't invent restrictions. So, yeah, buddy, you're trying to force all that flush all that way. I said, this is not going to happen. And I said, you need to get in there and cut that evaporator out and go clean it out now. So yeah, if he would have somehow not tried to control for that and not pulled a good vacuum or something and had that amount of liquid flush left in the system, yeah, you're probably going to have pretty bad effects on the system.
Well, let's take one more example. And I don't know if you're going to know the answer to this one or not, but I'm going to put it out there and we'll see what you say. You have to change out a compressor because it's burned out and you're putting a new compressor in. Guys are saying flush that area. That's a condenser. Is that something that you should be doing or taking other procedures into account?
Flushing the condenser out?
Flushing the condenser out because you put in a new compressor after a compressor had a burnout. The oil turned acidic and damaged the compressor, so it had to be replaced. Guys are saying to flush the condenser because that's the area where some of that oil is at. Like if you have an accumulator and a heat pump or something like that.
Yeah.
Should you be flushing the condenser or ripping the parts out and changing them?
You should rip them out and change them. That one's pretty clear in all the guidelines for flushes is avoiding the condenser.
Okay. Well, it makes sense because I think a lot of stuff gets trapped in there. And I know that because I've trapped the stuff in there myself.
Yep. Yeah, like I would encourage people to look at the guidelines of any line set flushes, especially like I said, what the OEMs say. The OEMs say take caution with flush on leaving it in the equipment. And that's the big one they point to is the condenser and the compressor.
The biggest reason why I stopped using flush is because I had never started using it correctly.
Yeah, there's so many tools in this industry. There's so many chemicals and tools and rules. There is more misinformation to sort through than actual raw facts. And that's what becomes difficult is you guys are so pressed when you're technicians and out in the field. There's so much getting thrown at you all the time. And then you might have 4 or 5 wholesalers calling on you and suppliers, and they're offering you new things. You don't always get to do a 1-hour study course on every little thing that's out there. So I think a lot of people just kind of in frustration said, oh, I'm hearing bad things. I'm stepping away from these. And I meet people all the time that say, oh, my OEM banned it. And I'm like, which one? And they'll say something like Goodman, for example. And I'm like, well, you can go to the Goodman direct distribution store and they sell the flush. Like Goodman owns that store. Like same thing. I heard Train had banned it. I'm like, well, a couple of their stores buy our flush. So it's kind of weird if they would ban it and also buy it at the same time. And virtually every major wholesaler I deal with sells a flush. When I got challenged by a few guys online to go, no, you're wrong, and all the OEMs have ganged up and banned all this. And so I was like, not only did I do the online research, I have 100 and some odd wholesale companies I work with, all the large ones, So I start calling them. I said, hey, are you hearing this from your OEMs? And they're like, nope, other than the warnings about don't leave it in the system. No, they're not hearing that out there. So
yeah, I did some research myself before the show. And I saw that there was a lot of OEMs out there that are actually saying you can use flush. They're detailing when to use flush. So they're agreeing with what you said.
Yeah.
The big thing out there is misinformation for the guys in the field who don't really have time to do a ton of research. They have to use guys like me and you coming in here telling them what's really going on and how to really use the product. Because if you're like me 10 years ago, maybe trying to flush a burnout out some kind of archaic way that was never detailed in any instructions anywhere.
Yep.
It's good that we're here now to say Zach was a moron.
We all started out there. We all come from the same spot. Some of us are still morons. I just make it look good. But I live in a world of misinformation dealing with R22 alternatives all day long, and still the rampant misinformation that exists in that world is never ending. And so, yeah, I'm kind of used to having to go out there and fight for the facts and kind of let people know what's going on. And again, always tell people when I'm in these kind of semi-heated online debates about about HVAC is I could be wrong. We all could be wrong if we need to share the facts on here, because you get those guys on these groups and, you get in these postings that got hundreds of comments in there, and people are just throwing information around that is just so wrong and misinformed, and they throw it out as pure fact. They don't put it out there objectively like, hey guys, I think I've heard this. Can anybody help me verify it? Am I right or wrong here? Kind of like how you ask something, you're going, hey, I'm not the authority on this. No one really is. Let's talk it out. Nope, you get guys that come in there and just big dumb fact, big dumb opinion, slam it down. Let's not do any research, any sourcing. Sourcing is extremely important. Do you have a source for that? And people read that and go, wow, that guy must be right. He seems pretty confident in that answer. But like I said, it's like a lot of things. There's people kind of want to throw stuff out there as if they know it. I mean, come on, have you ever read a car forum about cars? I mean, some people pretty opinionated there too, without a lot of facts. So
yeah, I've seen that. I've actually seen you on Facebook going back and forth about 422B and alternatives and different subjects. It's a lot of fun to watch some of the comments since we've spoken about it before. And I know a lot of the facts about it because I do my own research as well. And just see that all the things that they're saying are wrong.
Yeah.
And you have to come in there and say, no, you're wrong. And the guy's like, well, no, I'm not wrong. And the reason why is I saw it on Facebook on a different thread. That's not sourcing that you're talking about.
Yep. I mean, there's so many variables there. And it's just, I want to help folks and I want folks to help me. If there's something out there that I'm not aware of, I need to know about it. But man, I mean, I'm not talking about like a back and forth. I mean, I will get hate messages talking about R22 alternatives and go back and go, well, I can show, what are we now? What year is it now? So 17 years on our R22 replacement we have out here in Indianapolis. I can show 17 years of field use history, like actual contractors buying it, installing it with 17 years of field success. And people go, oh, those things never worked. And it just kicks you right in the chest. You're like, oh, come on. Here we go again. I'm glad people, they don't want to just be yes men for all things thrown at them. But at the same time, it's like, this stuff actually works if you follow the instructions. I think that's where all arguments always end up landing is with anything in the world. Did you read the book? Are you just throwing this stuff around willy-nilly?
That's exactly what it comes down to, because that's what I didn't do. But I think we're missing the most important question of the day here because we're wrapping things up. I felt like we did a good job explaining this stuff. If there's any questions, you can email me at hvacshoptalk@gmail.com. I can actually hook you up with Matt and he can answer your questions if I can't, which will be entirely likely. But the biggest question is, what kind of air conditioner are you putting in at your house today?
I am not going to answer that question. Absolutely
I knew you would not answer.
No way. No. I'll tell you, it's the one that was on the house before, same brand. I'm going to make a lot of fans here for the ones I don't have. It is not about the badge on the system. It's about the quality of the install. So I got these guys. I used to sell to them when I was in the wholesale world. They're a family company down the road. I trust them. So, yeah, it's got a good badge on it, but I trust the people even more. They're a real good group, and just being around them for about 5 years, never heard a bad thing said about them. Quality to the install. So I'm sure that won't start any debate, because every time I get on Facebook and someone says, hey, what brand is best? Prepare for about a 500 comment argument of people slinging mud at each other. And
I'm trying to drum up some ratings by having an argument about what brand you chose, but I guess you're going to dodge that, which is smart. That's a smart thing.
Yeah.
All right. Here's a question that you can answer. What level of efficiency did you get with that brand?
Oh, man. I am north of the Mason-Dixon line, so I got to go in with a wonderful 13 SEER R410A unit.
I like it. What else would the R22 drop-ins guy get than the basic 13 SEER?
Yep. They're like, do you want the Platinum Series? What are they up to now? 800 SEER, the condenser's 12 foot tall and 8 foot wide. They have to crane lift it into the yard. They're like, hey, we got our energy efficiency up. I'm like, yeah, because you quadrupled the size of the unit. That's some pretty good science you guys knocked out there.
That's right. We add the girth to the coil, we get efficiency. That's what we do. Yep. Okay, well, I won't badger you any longer. I appreciate you coming by and talking to me again. We'll have you on again because there's a great subject we're going to talk about. We're not going to give it away now, but maybe in a few months you can come back and talk about that. We discussed it beforehand.
We're going to cool all the homes with propane. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's one of the things, actually. But the other thing is the next replacement refrigerator.
Yes. The holy grail, the next big one to drop. So, yeah, we'll save that thriller for later.
If you would like to support HVAC Shop Talk podcast, please consider purchasing one of our shirts or stickers.